Welcome back, Mary. It's been too long since we've had you on the podcast.
It's so good to be back. You guys are awesome and fun.
Oh, well, we are just excited to dive into this very relevant conversation. So, you had a book come out called Love, Pray, Listen: Parenting Your Wayward Adult Kids with Joy. And this is just a very relevant, very timely, very timely book. And I want to start off by reading a passage. I mean, it's a short passage, but I feel like it's just so good to start us off in this interview. Sadly, once children leave home, many parents feel missionless, as if their job is completed and they have lost direction and purpose. Yet Jesus fulfilled his most important purpose after his high priestly prayer when he commissioned his followers. Our lives are not over after disciplining and training our children. They are only beginning. There is joy, purpose, and adventure when we make it our aim to love, pray, and listen to our adult children. That is so beautiful because it is true that as kids get older, so whether parents are saying goodbye to their children yet, or they're just older and they're not needing them as much, we start to go through a transition ourselves and wonder, what is my purpose? So can you just start by speaking to that very big question?
Exactly. Great question. I believe that actually some of our best productive kingdom work happens after our kids leave the nest. Now, of course, it is kingdom work to raise your kids, so don't hear me wrong in that. But we have so much more time, freedom, resources, energy, and I feel like what has happened with a lot of my people in my age group has been that they have become so sidelined by the choices of their adult children that they just don't, it truly sidelines them. And my thought is, if the enemy's trying to take out your kids, he's got, kind of a quasi victory there. Nothing's, over because you're still praying for them, and that victory is short lived. But he has that one victory. Don't let him have another victory by you jumping out of the race because of your sadness.
Hmm. Oh my gosh. that I mean, we could just stop right here. We could just stop the interview right here. I think that's true. How do you see people when you say dropping out of the race? How do you see people doing that?
One way is that there are some parents out there that their children make some pretty hard choices, and they alter their theology to mesh with their children's choices, which then kind of weakens their past resolve that they had in their faith, if that makes sense. Some people just grow depressed and discouraged, and they ask the question, well, I thought I did everything right, and this is how God rewards me. And so then they're out of the race in the sense of they're not serving the Lord because they're mad at the Lord. And then there's just kind of this loss of purpose, as you mentioned in that quote. And it may simply be that you just don't know. So now you've got the rest of your life ahead of you, and you have been doing this one thing for so long, you simply don't know what the next thing is. Are you going to be teaching? Are you going to be, going overseas and doing missions? I mean, there's just so many different things, but there's this paralyzing fear of, I could choose 100 different things, and so we choose none.
Which is almost a parallel process to our young adult children. Many of them, right, are overwhelmed by the burden of choice.
Yes, it is that. I think I know there's a book out there that's been written about that, but there is so much in our world today. In fact, I think that's why this is unrelated, but it is related. It's why I am constantly donating things in my house, because I don't want all this stuff. And the more stuff I have, the more choices I have to make. And I'm already overwhelmed with choices. And so, of course, the bottom line of that is I'm not donating my children. They're still my children. But, there's something to be said about getting rid of clutter in your life.
Mm-hmm. Going back to what you were just saying a minute ago about how the choices of our young adult children or even our teen children can sideline us. Andy Stanley says it this way, which I think is so interesting. North Point, his church, hosted a conference for parents of LGBTQ plus children. And he was talking about that because it caused some scuffle. But regardless of where people stand on that issue, that's not what I'm talking about. But I thought he said something so insightful. He said, when kids come out of the closet, their parents often go in the closet and they often go in separate closets and they hide. And I don't care what topic you are speaking of, when children make a choice that is hard for you in some way, parents often go into hiding and they feel that somehow their faith is diminished or that somehow they've done something wrong. And so they shrink. And that is just a reality. I don't know how, I felt like it was such a good way to say it because it doesn't matter what the issue is. The fact remains that the response by parents is often still the same. And so what do you say to those parents who are facing some painful things with their young adults or teens, and they have gone into hiding a little bit or they've shrunk?
I would say the thing that I've said to a lot of audiences around the world is this: an untold story never heals. And so if you're not talking about it with safe community, you will not heal from it. You'll stay in that closet. It is excruciating. It does open you up to criticism, but actually I think you'll be surprised that you are the one that gives yourself the most criticism about it, not your friends who love you well. And you'll also be surprised, especially in the LGBTQ space, how many parents are actually dealing with this, but we're not healing from it or working through it because we are ashamed or whatever. We feel guilty, whatever it is that we feel, we're keeping it quiet. You will never heal unless you find safe community and talk about it. So that's my encouragement for parents walking through that.
How do you encourage people to do that, to talk about it, if they're balancing it with privacy of their young adults or teens who have asked them to not share about something?
Yeah, I think I would first tell my adult child or my teen that I don't process alone, and I will be processing this with an extremely small, intimate group because I need to for my own mental health. And they get to have their story. You get to have your story. Your story isn't really their story. Your story is how I'm going to respond to this. And so you shouldn't be silenced by your child. You're a person. You get to make some choices. Now, that doesn't mean that you stick it up on the prayer chain and tell everybody. It's more like I'm advocating one or two people. Now, it could be that in the circle of your marriage, you can do that and that would work just fine. I've found that it is helpful if each of the married people have a close friend that they could talk to as well, because there's going to be different approaches based on your gender and just your life experience. It's always good to process with an exceptionally safe person who has proven themselves over years to be a secret keeper and yet who is wise and offers counsel. So when I say an untold story never heals, I'm not talking about broadcasting it. I'm talking about finding at least one friend that is safe to be able to process with.
That's a really good distinction because I think in our world, for some reason, we think that broadcasting is somehow the only way or is the only way to true authenticity and vulnerability. And that's just not true. That the way to true authenticity and vulnerability is being real with a close circle who have earned trust. And that protects everyone. It protects your child, actually. And also you're going to be better for your child. And there's neuroscience behind that. I mean, when we tell our stories, the brain is physiologically mending, which I find to be so fascinating. So there's even there's even a physical aspect to this that I find fascinating. So Mary, when kids have made a decision that you don't agree with, you don't like, and you feel gut punched. I was just having a conversation this week with a friend who literally just felt gut punched by her child in the decision that he made. How do we respond in those moments?
First, offer yourself grace for your response, because usually your first gut reaction is not the most holy reaction. And I've definitely done that, where I've had to go back to my adult child and say, I'm so sorry I responded that way. It wasn't the way I wanted to. I was shocked, and this is how I responded. It wasn't right. Please forgive me. So you always do have that opportunity to be a human and respond in a normal way, but also not only to offer yourself grace, but to apologize if you quote unquote mess it up. I would say too that it might be good for you, before those things happen, to think through it. Ask yourself the question, well, you have other friends who have kids who have made all sorts of different kinds of decisions. You probably have friends whose kids are substance abusers and broke into their home to steal money, and you have people with different gender orientations, and you've got all these different kinds of things. Ask yourself, discuss with your friend or with your spouse that issue. Like, what would you do? Think it through before, so that when it does happen, you'll be able to have a more reasoned and seasoned response than if it just plops on you. And then I would say too, to give grace. The Lord walked with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He was their parent. He was the perfect parent. He did everything right. He was present with them. He loved them well. And his two children rebelled against him. And so there is no such thing, obviously, as a perfect parent. But if God, as the perfect parent, had rebellious children, who are we to think that we won't? And then also think about the fact that the Lord also has all these billions of rebellious. Every one of us has gone astray. So the Lord understands what it's like.
He has billions.
Billions alive today and all before. So every human being has rebelled against him. And so we have this empathetic God who understands what it's like to have your child rebel against you. And he had the benefit of being perfect. And we, of course, we don't, because we're not perfect parents. And so maybe that will take the edge off someone today. Because I think what we thought, at least me, when I was reading all those parenting books in the 90s and the early 2000s, I was like, okay, just give me the formula. Just tell me what to do. And I did it. And then, it was like parenting was this beautiful machine and you did everything right. And then you spit out these robot children who always made all the right choices. And then when the robot children got wills of their own and they were like AI and went crazy and took over the world, then we lose our ever-loving minds, because in our minds we think, well, I did what God told me to do, even though it was just a book, and it didn't work. So either I must have done something wrong or God is untrustworthy. And those two things are not necessarily true. Of course, 100% of us have done something wrong, but that doesn't mean it is a causation doesn't make causation, or whatever that statement is. Correlation is not causation. So we have to be careful. I just gave you like a big dump of a lot of information, but that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, but it's a big dump of truth that we fall short as well. And we don't want our kids to have free will, because it doesn't go with our plan, because we have a plan for them. And yet God gave them free will, just like he gave us free will. And we often, I'll speak in the first person, I often forget Like, this is God's plan for them to have free will. Like, he had the option of not doing it this way, and he did it this way. And as a result, just like every person that has ever walked the planet, our children do things that cause them pain. And we don't want that as parents. We want to protect them. That's our natural bent. And yet we can't as they go out into the world. And we're coming from a stage of parenting where we could protect them from a lot, not from everything, but from a lot of the external world we could. And now we can't. And that's just hard. It's a hard transition.
I often joke that I really love free will for myself, but I don't want it for my children. So basically what you just said, Ellen.
Well, and that whole idea of we always point the finger back to ourselves when something goes wrong. And I think moms are especially prone to this, where soon as something happens, we say, what did I do? Instead of allowing people to have personal responsibility. And this is something I've really had to grow in. And it's called codependency. And even if we don't think we're codependent, a lot of times we are because we're not separating. And I remember having that revelation of, oh, wow, that's a codependent behavior that I didn't even know I was practicing. So how do we stop pointing the finger at ourselves the second something goes wrong?
Not be human, become robots. I think that's back to Romans 12, 1 and 2 about that retraining of the mind, which again is, a throwback or a throw forward to neural pathways and brain science and all of that. It's this reordering of the mind of speaking the truth to yourself. And I do think there's also needing to be in that a severing of the tie between you and your adult child. I think we feel so connected to them as they're little kids, when they're toddlers, when they're elementary, even junior high, and sometimes even high school, where we're like, our identity is kind of wrapped together and theirs is wrapped with ours. Once they leave the home and they're adults, we have to sever that, not in a, I'm never going to love you again and I'm not going to be your mom anymore. In a just psychological way of, they are making their own choices. I am making my own choices. I am going to love, pray, and listen for them, listen to them. And that's all I can do, which is why the title of the book came about. What can you do? You can love them. You can pray for them. No one's going to stop you from that. You can listen to them. And that's what you can do. And differentiating yourself from them is going to bring you a lot of joy. And it's hard, but it's hard to do.
Yeah, but you can practice it, right? As kids are getting older and you start seeing that horizon of like, at some point they're going to have to be a little more independent. You can consciously practice and say, I'm not going to make this decision for you. You need to make it. At what age do you suggest moms start thinking that? I mean, is it like from 2, we're discerning this is an independence you can have? At what age would you say parents should really be starting to let their teenagers make some decisions for themselves?
Yeah, I see it kind of as a line descending from top to bottom, left to right. So when they are babies and toddlers, you have this high level of control. And as they get older and older and older and older and older, you're decreasing your control until by the time they're a senior in high school, they're making most of their decisions and you've trained them to do that. What often happens is, and to answer your question, I think in the junior high school ranges, you really need to be thinking about letting them start to make their own decisions. But what happens sometimes is we start on that high control and we stay there. And there was a study that I cited in a book I wrote a long time ago, Authentic Parenting in a Postmodern Culture. And the study was, they studied high control parental environments. So just parents that had high control until the kid went to college. And they found that kids in that high control environment, when they got to college, they were, I can't remember the stat, but it was something like 50% more likely to follow a cult leader than not. And it's because they had not ever made any decisions for themselves, and they were all freaked out. And so who are they going to be attracted to? Someone who has all the answers and will order their life for them. And so when they start reaching that 12, 13, 14 year, we need to begin to think, I am working myself out of a job, and my job is to prepare them to make decisions. And if I always rescue them and don't let real world consequences deal their important blows, we're going to have a real big problem when they hit 19 years old and they're on their own.
Yeah. So I think that's a great segue to what do we do? And it's helpful because the title of your book tells us, but I would love to break each one down. I mean, love, pray, listen. I think when we hear those, we know what that means, but I'd like to hear a little more robustly. Let's take each one. Let's start with love. So what does love look like to our young adults?
So the whole book is structured around 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient, love is kind. And so each phraseology I am exegeting to help us to flesh out what love is. Contrary to popular belief, this is not a passage about marriage. Paul is writing it to a jacked up church with really bad relationships. And so what he's talking about is, here's how to handle relationships. And this is what love looks like in difficult relationships. So what better way to know what love is than to look at all of those facets or parts of love? I think one of the phraseologies in there is, does not rejoice in unrighteousness. I think that's really important, because in the world today, there's some sort of lie out there that says, it used to be, if you love me, you'll approve of me. But now it's, if you love me, you will applaud everything that I do. But actually, Jesus talks about speaking the truth, or Paul talks about speaking the truth in love. And those two are very important. Truth and love must be married. And that means when someone is, doing something wrong, and this is before, prior to them leaving your house, you confront them on it, right? It gets a little more interesting when they're out of the house, because at that point, it's more permission based. If your adult child comes to you and says, hey, I'm $25,000 in debt, what do I do? Then you can answer that question because they're asking for your help. But if you surreptitiously know that and go to them and tell them things to do, it's a different kind, because it's not invitation based anymore, if that makes sense.
Okay, so invitation based. What else? What else does love look like to someone who maybe also is aware that they are making decisions that they know you don't really love?
I think part of it is to continue in an open dialogue with your adult child, and not to major on the minors and minor on the majors. And so an example that we have learned is, what I've been seeing with kids and parents in this age is that adult kids now are typically different politically than their parents. And this has caused a lot of cancellation on both sides, both from kids and from parents. They cannot have conversations around a dinner table about it anymore. I think that's tragic, and it shouldn't be that way. And so one way to approach that is in love and with humility, of that you can't possibly know every aspect of every issue that's ever, befallen our political landscape. So why not be curious and become a listener? So an example would be, and we've actually had this around our table, here's a really hard issue, the issue of abortion. So we are able to have a beautifully civil conversation, because what we're trying to do is, let's find some common ground here. And we were all able to agree that we all believed in human flourishing, that we all believed that it was important to look at the health of a mom and her dire predicament that she might be in. And so we could have a conversation from that point on, even though it was a charged political issue, but we were humble enough, and my kids were humble enough to be able to say, instead of this like black and white, you're either bad or you're good, this like nuanced conversation of, well, there are every issue that you could find some common ground. So that's one encouragement I would give to parents.
There's a section in your book that I really love, and it says, basically, it's like, okay, when children are young, they ask, it's talking about the questions that they ask. But now that they're adults, it doesn't mean that they're not asking those same questions or similar questions. Will you love me if I stray from the faith? Will you love me if I descend into depression? Will you love me if I'm same-sex attracted? Will you love me if I'm addicted? Will you love me if I choose a spouse you don't approve of? Will you love me if I divorce? Will you love me if I fail at my job? Will you love me if I don't choose the career path you wanted me to follow? I mean, oh my goodness. Like, those are big questions that I agree. I think our kids are asking. So how do you communicate that? How do you communicate that if they are failing at a job, or they're choosing a career path that you didn't want them to, or they're in depression? I mean, what does that look like in daily practice?
Yeah, good question. For me, again, I think this comes back to permission based. Like, if my adult children come to me and they're upset about something in their life, and usually has something to do with the choice that they've made, it's better for me if I err on the side of empathy. And this was really the premise of the book, Love and Logic, Parenting with Love and Logic, is you allow them to have their circumstances, you allow them to have the weight of what they've done, but you empathize with the pain that they're in. And I kind of try to over communicate my love to them. And so maybe err on the side of, if there's some other part of their life that they're doing well in, I am so proud of you. You're doing great at your job. And when I was your age, I was super irresponsible, but you're killing it and you're just doing a great job. So finding ways to praise them is really, really important, because that balances out when they come and they're talking to you about their failed marriage, or they're talking to you about their addiction. And you can always just begin the conversation with, thank you for entrusting that to me. I am so humbled and grateful. I love you. I am for you. If you want some help with this, I am willing to offer advice. It gets a little more tricky when it comes to substance abuse, because we have to have some boundaries. We don't want to rescue someone who is in active addiction and just keep giving them money so they could have more drugs. So of course there's some nuance there as well. But I agree with what you're talking about, Krista, about this. They're always asking the question, will you love me if? And with that, we have to go back to the Lord. He loves me. He loves me when I make mistakes. He loves me when I sin. He loves me when I am a mess. He still loves me. And so if we're to demonstrate that kind of love, it doesn't mean that we approve of it, and it doesn't mean God approves of it when we are sinning, but he still loves us.
I also think that is great as we transition to listen. What does listen mean? Because what you just said right there, it doesn't mean we approve. And I think a lot of times we think if we listen well and we're good listeners and we're empathizing, that somehow we're putting our stamp of approval on it. And I think that's what parents are afraid of, because they're saying in their heads, I don't want my child to think this is okay. And yet listening and empathizing isn't doing that. But we in a strange way, we correlate those two things. Mm-hmm. So give us a picture of what it looks like to listen, that active listening that actually isn't necessarily approval, but it enters in with them and it helps them to feel seen.
Yeah, I think I was listening to someone talking about a converse. Actually, there was no conversation. The person was in a friend of theirs was in a medical situation. They were in the hospital, and this person was just beside himself. And a friend of his came and sat next to him, and he said nothing. He just sat there, cried with him, said zero words. And I think sometimes we think, well, when I'm listening, I've got to say a bunch of stuff or I have to be super wise. Sometimes it's just crying with them, just listening. I think a lot of relationship would be restored if we zipped our mouths and just simply listened. Beyond that, then having active listening is important. So to really show someone you love them, you listen to them, and then you ask them questions. Well, how did that make you feel? Well, what do you want to do about that? What's your solution to this problem? And just let them work it out, but be that active listener as well. This is the way that we dignify one another. We see today, and it is quantified, that we are in a crisis of loneliness in this world. And that there are many people around the world who don't even feel like they have one friend. So just think about how powerful it could be if you as a parent could be a safe listener and a safe haven to your crisis-ridden adult child.
I can see how that is true for a child who has left home, who I am no longer responsible for. But for the 15-year-old or 16-year-old who still needs some boundaries and maybe some consequences from a parent, how do you balance that in wanting to be that empathetic listener and say, and this is now, as your parent, I need to enforce this consequence?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to communicating clear rules and boundaries ahead of time. And once that's violated and that it's already been agreed upon, hey, if you do overuse your phone past 3 a.m. and I have proof, then your phone's in the box and you don't get it for a week. So that it's not like a surprise, like you're not disciplining them out of anger or, oh, I'm going to just take that away from you. But it has been already thought out prior to. And of course, when they're under your roof, and we had this with our kids, when they were under our roof, we got to make the rules because we were the parents and we were paying the bills and feeding those people. So yes, of course. But you also want to have that conversation with them that says, this is going to be a consequence for you. The reason I'm allowing it is that in a year or two, you're not going to be here anymore. And I so much want you to learn what the consequence is for this kind of behavior or this kind of lifestyle. Now, when you're out from underneath my roof, however you say it, when you're out, then you will bear those consequences. But I'm trying to train you now to make better and wiser choices.
So, okay, let's transition to pray. I think that's a great one for us to end on today. What does praying look like specifically for our children? Because I think often we get in ruts with prayer, and that's not just in parenting, that's just in everything. We can get in ruts or pray the same things over and over, or really see God as a genie, that God, if you really love me and you really love my children, you would fix this. You would help me in this and it would be gone, right? Because we want to just pray pain away. So how do we pray more effectively?
One thing I'm learning is that it is an interesting prayer to pray. Lord, I don't know if or when you're going to resolve this angst I have with my adult child, but what is it that you're trying to teach me in my maturity journey that I can embrace right now? And that is a beautiful prayer that the Lord always answers. I want you to be more patient. I want you to trust that I've got this and I have the control, you don't. I want you to learn how to let go. I want you to learn what long suffering means. I want you to learn what long-term prayer means. And so there's always a lesson in that. Another thing I would say is to write your prayers, because I think a lot of times we don't realize the answer to those prayers often because they're not written down. Another option that I've done, if my child is in a place to receive it, I wrote out prayers for one of my children for like a month and a half every day and gave that to that child for Christmas. And a couple years later, I asked, what was the best gift you've ever received? And they said that. So consider that. Now, there's some kids out there that if you gave them a book of your handwritten prayers, they'd be like, get away, you're trying to manipulate me. I don't love Jesus anymore and leave me alone. So you have to have discernment there. But you also could keep doing it until they turn a corner and then hand it to them. So it might just be a really interesting practice.
That's really beautiful, Mary. I love that idea. Like also, I think sometimes when we're in places of, for lack of a better word, crisis, we feel like we're in crisis with our kids, even if they're not aware that we're in crisis. we want something tangible, something results oriented a little bit. And when there's no results to be had. So I feel like in some ways that is a great way to do that, because you have something tangible every day. I have written out this prayer for my child. I have poured out my love onto this page on their behalf. And that feels so tangible. Oh, I just love that. I love it. Well, Mary, as we are closing today, this has been so helpful. What would be your final words of encouragement for parents who are in a hard place with their young adults or teenagers?
Well, I would say I think a lot of parents in this place get to the place they don't even know how to pray. So there is a free 52-week prayer thing that I've created, and they can get it at marydemuth.com/LPL, which stands for Love, Pray, Listen. And it will give you a PDF of 52 weekly prayers you can pray for your kids, and you can just stick their name in the blanks. But I would also say it's not the end of the world. God still loves you. And remember what you were like when you were 20. That might help you, because I think we're the age that we are wiser than we were in our 20s. But if we go back and remember what it was like starting off adult life and all the mistakes that we made, it may encourage us to realize they're just normal kids trying to ask questions, trying to find out who they are. Some of them are trying on not being a Christian. Some of them are trying on identities, and it's terrible and no one likes it, but they may like it, but we don't like it. Remember that you were probably a bit cray-cray and messed up in your 20s too, and the Lord matured you and brought you to where you are today over the years. And so just remember that. Try not to put so much pressure that the moment they turn 18 in one day that they've got to have all these answers and live this perfect life. Nobody could live that. Nobody could do it except Jesus.
Thank you, Mary. It's a great word. Thank you for this book, for this message, and also just for speaking truth around this. It's such a vulnerable time in life, and I think we feel that. We feel that as parents, and it's just so wonderful to have your encouragement. Thank you.
Thanks.